The dragons came on a Tuesday morning in late summer. No one expected them. No one could have expected them. One moment the sky was blue and clear, and the next moment it was torn open like paper. A great hole appeared above the Pacific Ocean, glowing with colors that hurt to look at. Then the dragons poured through like water from a broken dam. They were huge. The smallest ones were the size of passenger jets. The largest ones cast shadows over entire cities. Their scales gleamed like metal in the sunlight, and their eyes burned with ancient fire. They had wings that blocked out the sun when they flew overhead, and their roars shook buildings to their foundations. The world tried to fight back. Fighter jets scrambled from every base on the planet. Missiles streaked through the sky toward the invaders. Armies mobilized and pointed every weapon they had at the dragons descending upon their cities. None of it mattered that the missiles exploded against dragon scales and did nothing. The scales were harder than any material humans had ever created. Bullets bounced off like rain. When the dragons breathed fire, it was hotter than anything nature had ever produced on Earth. Tanks melted. Aircraft fell from the sky in burning pieces. Soldiers died by the thousands, then by the millions. The dragons did not speak to humanity at first. They simply destroyed. Tokyo burned in a single night. London fell in 3 days. New York lasted a week only because so many dragons wanted a piece of it that they got in each other's way. The great cities of Earth became tombs and then became nothing but ash and broken stone. Some countries tried nuclear weapons. The dragons did not fear radiation. They did not fear the blast. One dragon, a massive black creature with scales that seemed to drink in light, flew directly into a nuclear explosion and emerged on the other side completely unharmed. The fire only seemed to make it stronger. After that, no one tried nuclear weapons again. Within 3 months, organized human resistance ended. There were no more governments. There were no more armies. There were only survivors, hiding in whatever holes they could find, trying to stay alive one more day. Then the dragons finally spoke. Their voices boomed across the ruined world, carried by some kind of magic that let every human hear them regardless of distance. They announced that Earth now belonged to them. They divided the planet among themselves, each great dragon claiming a territory to rule. Humans would serve them or die. It was that simple. The tributes began. The dragons demanded gold and precious metals for their hoards. They demanded food and livestock. And sometimes, when they were bored or hungry or simply cruel, they demanded humans. No one could refuse. Refusal meant fire and death. Billions of people died in the first year. Some died in the initial attacks. Some died in the chaos that followed, when food systems collapsed and medicine ran out. Some died in the tributes, taken to dragon lairs and never seen again. By the end of that first terrible year, Earth's population had fallen from 8 billion to less than 3 billion. The dragons settled into their new kingdoms and found them satisfactory. They had done this before, on other worlds in other dimensions. They had ruled for thousands of years in their home realm before they grew bored and opened the rifts to find new territories. They had conquered dozens of worlds, and humanity was no different from any other prey species they had encountered, or so they believed. In the ruins of what had once been civilization, humans did something the dragons did not expect. They survived. Not just a few of them, but millions of them, scattered across the planet in underground shelters and hidden valleys in forgotten corners of the world. They survived in the subway tunnels of destroyed cities, living like rats in the darkness. They survived in remote mountain villages that the dragons considered too small to bother with. They survived in deep bunkers that had been built for other wars and now served a purpose no one had imagined. They survived in the frozen north and the burning deserts and everywhere in between. The dragons noticed them, of course. It was impossible not to notice the scurrying creatures that had once ruled this world. But they did not care. Humans without armies, without cities, without technology, were no threat. They were simply part of the landscape now, like deer or cattle. Something to hunt when bored, something to use when needed, but nothing to worry about. This was the dragon's first mistake. In a collapsed university building in what had once been Switzerland, a woman named Yuki Tanaka found a working laboratory. In the mountains of Russia, former soldiers began to experiment with new weapons. In the jungles of South America, engineers figured out how to build machines that could hide from dragon eyes. In 100 different places, in 1,000 different ways, humans began to do what they had always done best. They learned. They experimented. They failed and tried again. They shared their knowledge through whispered messages and secret meetings. They watched the dragons with careful eyes, noting their habits and their weaknesses and their blind spots. The dragons had ruled other worlds for millennia. They had never been defeated. They had never even been seriously challenged. They looked at humanity and saw only weakness and fear. They did not understand that humanity had not given up. Humanity was waiting. Humanity was adapting. And humanity had a very, very long memory. 30 years passed after the dragons came. A full generation grew up knowing nothing but the world of dragon rule. Children were born in underground tunnels and hidden shelters. They learned to walk quietly, to never light fires that could be seen from above, to freeze at the distant sound of wings. Fear was their first lesson, and silence was their second. But there were other lessons too. In the ruins of Geneva, Yuki Tanaka grew old, but never stopped working. Her hair turned gray and then white, and her hands developed a slight tremor, but her mind remained sharp. She led a team of scientists who had spent 3 decades studying everything they could about dragons. They dissected dragon scales that had been shed or torn loose in battles between rival dragons. They analyzed dragon fire and dragon magic and the strange energy that flowed through dragon bodies. One night, Yuki made a discovery that changed everything. She found that dragon scales were not simply hard. They were held together by a kind of magical bond, a force that human science had never encountered before. But like all bonds, it could be broken. She discovered a specific frequency of sound, too high for human ears to hear, that could disrupt this magical bond. When exposed to this frequency, dragon scales became weak. Not weak like steel or stone, but weak like glass, fragile, breakable. Yuki I shared her discovery through the network that had slowly grown over the decades. Messengers carried coded information through the dragon territories. Radio operators sent short bursts of encrypted data in the dead of night. The knowledge spread from shelter to shelter, from bunker to bunker, from continent to continent. In the Ural Mountains, a group of former military engineers received the information and began designing weapons that could generate the right frequency. They worked in a hidden facility deep underground, building prototypes and testing them on the few dragon scales they had collected. When they succeeded in shattering a scale for the first time, grown men and women wept with joy. In Southeast Asia, engineers developed drones. These were not like the drones of the old world. They were small, barely larger than birds, and they were fast. They could carry small payloads and deliver them with precision. Most importantly, they could be made by the hundreds using salvage materials and simple tools. No single drone was a threat to a dragon, but 100 drones or 1,000, carrying the right weapons at the right time, might be something else entirely. In South America, geneticists worked on a different problem. The world had changed since the dragons came. The air in many places was thick with ash and toxic gases from endless fires. Normal humans could not survive long in these areas. So the geneticists changed what it meant to be human, just a little. They created treatments that allowed human lungs to filter out poisons. They developed modifications that let human eyes see better in darkness. They made humans tougher, more resilient, better adapted to the ruined world. Thought the children who grew up with these modifications did not think of themselves as different. They were simply survivors, like everyone else. But they could go places their parents could not go. They could watch dragons from hiding spots that would have killed an ordinary person. They could gather information and carry messages through the most dangerous territories. And they did. Oh, how they did. The dragons noticed none of this. They were too busy with their own affairs. Dragon politics were complicated and violent. The great lords fought among themselves for territory and treasure. They formed alliances and broke them. They schemed and plotted against each other while their human subjects scurried beneath them like ants. Why would they notice what the ants were doing? The humans built a map. Not a physical map, but a shared understanding of every dragon territory on Earth. They knew which dragons were most dangerous and which were merely cruel. They knew which dragons slept during certain hours and which ones never seemed to rest. They knew the flight patterns of dragon patrols and the locations of dragon hordes. They knew more about dragon kind than the dragons knew about themselves. A young woman named Sarah Chen became one of the coordinators of this vast network. She'd have been born 3 years after the burning, and she had never seen the old world except in faded photographs. To her, this was simply life. The dragons were a problem to be solved, like bad weather or scarce food. And Sarah Chen was very good at solving problems. She organized the information that flowed in from 1,000 sources. She identified patterns that no single observer could see. She found weaknesses that the dragons did not know they had. And when she had enough information, she began to plan. The first rule of the plan was patience. The dragons were immortal, or close to it. They thought in centuries. Humans had to learn to think that way too. A premature attack would only alert the dragons to the threat and give them time to respond. Better to wait. Better to prepare. Better to be certain. The second rule was coordination. An attack in one place would accomplish nothing. The dragons would simply destroy whoever was responsible and go back to their comfortable lives. But an attack everywhere, all at once, by enemies the dragons did not know existed, that might be different. That might be enough. The third rule was secrecy. No dragon could learn what was being planned. No collaborator could be allowed to carry warning to their masters. The network enforced this rule ruthlessly. Those who could not be trusted were not told. Those who proved unworthy of trust disappeared quietly in the night. Sarah Chen looked at her maps and her reports and her carefully gathered intelligence. She calculated odds and weighed risks and made decisions that would affect millions of lives. She was 42 years old when she finally decided that they were ready. The time for waiting was almost over. Kragarax, the Eternal, had ruled the lands between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea for 30 years. He was old even by dragon standards, with scales that had darkened from red to nearly black over the centuries. He had conquered worlds before Earth and expected to conquer worlds after Earth. He feared nothing and no one. He slept in a mountain fortress that had once been a human military base. The humans had hollowed out the mountain long ago, creating vast underground chambers for their primitive weapons. Kragarax had expanded these chambers to suit his size and filled them with gold and treasures taken from 100 human cities. He slept surrounded by wealth, dreaming dragon dreams of fire and conquest. He did not dream of danger. Why would he? Nothing on this world could hurt him. Nothing anywhere could hurt him. He was Kragarax the Eternal, and he would live forever. The first resonance bomb struck his flank at 3:47 in the morning. It was small, barely larger than a human fist, and it exploded with a sound that no human ear could hear. But Kragarax heard it. He heard it deep in his bones, in his blood, in the very magic that held his body together. His scales cracked. Kragarax screamed. It was not a roar of anger or a bellow of challenge. It was a scream of pain, pure and terrible, the sound of a creature experiencing something it had not felt in millennia. His scales had been part of him for thousands of years, as much a part of his body as his wings or his fire. Now they were falling away, crumbling like dead leaves, exposing the flesh beneath. He tried to rise, tried to take flight, tried to escape whatever was attacking him. But the second wave was already coming. Dozens of small drones swarmed into his chamber, each carrying a payload of thermite specially designed to burn hotter than dragon fire. They struck his exposed flesh and ignited. Kragarax thrashed and burned. He blasted fire in every direction, but the drones were too small and too fast. For every one he destroyed, 2 more appeared. His chambers filled with smoke and the smell of burning dragon flesh. His treasures melted around him, gold running like water across the stone floor. Outside the mountain, Sarah Chen watched through a telescope. She was trembling. They all were. No human had ever killed a dragon before. No human had ever even tried, not since the failed attacks in the first months of the invasion. But they were trying now, and by all evidence, they were succeeding. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Inside the mountain, the sounds had stopped. The drones sent back images of Kragarax the Eternal lying still among the ruins of his horde, his great body torn and burned, his ancient eyes finally dark. Sarah Chen allowed herself to smile. Then she turned to her communications equipment and sent a single word to every human settlement in the network. The word was now. Across the world, in every dragon territory, humans attacked. They did not attack with armies or missiles or any of the weapons that had failed 30 years before. They attacked with resonance bombs and thermite drones, with traps carefully laid over decades, with knowledge painstakingly gathered and ruthlessly applied. In China, the Dragon Lord Shanlong died in his sleep, killed by poison gas that his scales could not protect against once the resonance weapons had done their work. In Brazil, the 3 sisters who ruled the Amazon found their jungle suddenly full of enemies and fire that burned hotter than their own breath. In Australia, a dragon who had grown complacent from decades of easy rule discovered that his human subjects had been digging tunnels beneath his lair, tunnels packed with explosives and resonance generators. Not every attack succeeded. Some dragons escaped. Some dragons fought back with terrible fury, destroying everything around them in their rage. Millions of humans died in the first day of the war, burned or crushed, or simply caught in the crossfire between ancient powers and desperate attackers. But for the first time in 30 years, dragons died too. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. Perhaps 100. No one knew the exact count in those first chaotic days, but the dragons knew that something had changed. Something fundamental. Something terrifying. The dragon lords who survived gathered in council for the first time since the conquest. They raged and argued and tried to understand what had happened. How had the humans developed weapons that could hurt them? How had they organized such a coordinated attack without any dragon noticing? How had creatures so small and weak and short-lived become such a threat? They decided on revenge. They would burn every human settlement they could find. They would hunt down every survivor and destroy them. They would remind these insects who ruled this world. But when they flew out to unleash their vengeance, they found that the humans had vanished. The underground shelters were empty. The hidden valleys were abandoned. The prey had scattered, disappearing into the vast and ruined landscape like ghosts. And the attacks continued. Every night, somewhere on Earth, another dragon died. The weapons grew more sophisticated. The tactics grew more refined. The humans learned from every failure and adapted to every dragon countermeasure. The dragons were not used to learning. They were not used to adapting. They had been the apex predators of a dozen worlds, unchanged and unchanging for millennia. Now they faced an enemy that evolved faster than they could comprehend, that struck from shadows and vanished before retaliation could come, that seemed to know their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. For the first time in their eternal lives, the dragons knew fear. The war lasted 12 years. It was not a war like the wars humans had fought among themselves, with front lines and battles and clear victories. It was a war of shadows and patience, of small strikes and careful retreats, of knowledge and adaptation. The dragons tried everything they could think of to defeat their enemy. They burned entire regions to ash, but the humans had already moved elsewhere. They flew in formations to protect each other, but the humans developed weapons that could strike multiple targets at once. They tried to make peace, offering humans better treatment in exchange for identifying the resistance leaders, but no one came forward. The humans had learned the dragon promises meant nothing. Slowly, the dragon numbers fell. Some died in attacks. Some died fighting each other over shrinking territories. Some simply left, fleeing back through the rift above the Pacific to find easier worlds to conquer. The dragons who remained grew desperate and vicious, lashing out at anything that moved. But their rage only made them easier to predict and easier to kill. Scythrix was one of the last. She was different from the other dragons. She was ancient, older even than Kragarax had been, and she had spent her long life studying and thinking rather than fighting and conquering. When the other dragons had dismissed humans as worthless vermin, Scythrix had watched them with curiosity. When the war began, she had been the first to understand what they were facing. She tried to negotiate. She sent human messengers with offers of peace, promising to withdraw all dragons from Earth forever in exchange for an end to the killing. The humans listened to her messengers and sent them back with a single word. The word was no. Scythrix understood. She had seen the tributes. She had seen the millions who died in dragon fire. She had seen the world that the dragons had made, and she knew that no promise could undo those memories. The humans would not stop until every dragon was dead or gone. She could have fled through the rift. Many dragons had, but Scythrix was tired. She had lived for so long, conquered so many worlds, watched so many civilizations rise and fall. She had thought Earth would be just another conquest, just another brief chapter in her endless existence. Instead, it had become something else entirely. On a spring morning in the place that had once been called Kansas, Scythrix landed in an open field and waited. She did not try to hide. She did not try to fight. She simply waited, her ancient eyes watching the sky, her great wings folded against her sides. The drones came first, then the ground teams with their resonance weapons. Scythrix made no move to defend herself. She watched the humans approach with something that might have been respect. One of the humans, a young man with modifications that let him breathe the ash-filled air, walked closer than the others. He looked up at the dragon and asked why she was not fighting. Scythrix told him that she had seen what humanity had become. She had seen them adapt and overcome and refuse to be conquered. She had seen them do what no other species in any world had ever done. She told him that she was proud to have been defeated by such enemies, and that the dragons had been wrong to underestimate them. Then she closed her eyes and waited for the end. When it was over, the humans stood in silence around the last dragon's body. They had won. After 42 years of fire and death and endless struggle, they had won. The dragons were gone, killed or fled through the rift to whatever dark dimension they had come from. The world was theirs again. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt. Not the world they had lost, because that world was gone forever, but something new. They emerged from their tunnels and shelters and found that they had changed. The old divisions of nation and race and religion seemed small and foolish after what they had survived together. They were all just humans now, members of a species that had looked extinction in the face and refused to blink. They studied the dragon corpses and learned their secrets. They examined the rift above the Pacific and figured out how it worked. They established monitoring stations around the world and in orbit, watching for any sign that the dragons might return. They taught their children everything that had happened, every detail of the burning and the long years of hiding and the war of shadows that had won back their world. Sarah Chum lived long enough to see the first human spacecraft launch toward the stars. She was old by then, her hair white and her body frail, but her eyes were still sharp. She watched the rocket rise into the sky and thought about all the people who had died to make this moment possible. Her granddaughter stood beside her, a young woman with lungs that could filter poison and eyes that could see in the dark. The girl asked what Sarah was thinking about. Sarah told her that she was thinking about adaptation, about how humanity had survived, not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most powerful, but because they could change. They could learn. They could look at any problem, no matter how impossible, and find a way to solve it. The rift above the Pacific remained open. Somewhere, in dimensions beyond counting, other powers had watched what happened on Earth. They had seen a species that should have been easy. Prey destroy creatures that had never been defeated before. They had seen something new in the universe. Some of them were curious. Some of them were afraid. Some of them were already making plans. Humanity watched the stars and waited. They built defenses and developed new technologies and trained new generations of fighters. They knew that the dragons might not be the last threat they faced. They knew that the universe was vast and ancient and full of things that considered humans nothing but prey. But they had adapted once. They had survived the impossible and won the unwinnable war. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way, together, patient, relentless, and they would never, ever give up.